I do. Whether you want to do it in the chat box or whether you want to unmute, either way is fine with me, and you're not going to disrupt anything. So I like to think about what I'm going to share so that you all know what my objectives are when putting together this talk. So one, I wanted to talk a little bit about why produce safety matters. It seems there is still sometimes a misunderstanding about why we're talking about produce safety, so I didn't want to discuss that. I put together a few things about farm market specific food safety. It should say farmers market because that's what the slides say. Talking about what we need to think about in terms of the market, what we need to think about in terms of the prep to going to the market, pre-market, all that kind of stuff. Then I do want to talk a little bit about the FSMA produce safety rule. And I realize not everyone is subject to the rule, but I think there really is something to be learned from thinking about what's going on with the rule in preparation for if you might be subject, or even if you're not, for looking at buyer demand and customer questions. I also want to mention the traceability rule updates because there is a new rule. That's not part of the produce safety rule. It's a different rule, but I want people, I just have, I think, 3 slides on that just to cue you in case you are subject to it. And then I tried to integrate resources throughout the talk so that you all could have access to information, and certainly can point you in the direction of other references or resources as well. So why does produce safety matter? And really, all farms have risks: microbial risks, physical risks, chemical risks, pretty much across the board. Turns out markets do too. So that's why produce safety matters, is that we know it can get contaminated at the farm level. We know it can get contaminated at the market level. And those contamination events, when they result in illnesses and outbreaks, have a negative impact on the industry. And what I mean by that is these risks can impact every grower, even if those risks aren't theirs. So it's interesting when there is an outbreak, who ends up being impacted by that. Certainly the grower where the outbreak originated, but there's often a lot of, I guess, what I would call collateral damage, in the sense of other growers get pulled in, whether the markets disappear, whether consumers don't recognize that the commodity being grown in their backyard or in their location, in their community, in their local farm market, is not associated with the commodity that had the outbreak. So there's a lot that goes on there. Food safety is also here. I mean, it's just a part of the reality we're dealing with. It's a regulatory rule. It's often a buyer requirement. It certainly is a consumer expectation. And I'd be interested to hear if you guys are getting more questions from consumers. That seems to be highly variable. Some growers will tell me consumers at their markets will ask, and others don't. And so that's an interesting discussion to me. I think the other thing that's really important to understand is that implementing food safety practices in many instances have benefits beyond food safety, right? They have positive impacts on shelf life, positive impacts on quality, positive impacts on business, we're finding, right? And it was really interesting through COVID. Growers that had implemented food safety practices seemed to adapt better to the COVID requirements because they had a lot of structural things in place. And I don't mean infrastructure. Well, some of it was infrastructure, but more, I mean, like their operation was set up to adjust to new training requirements and new expectations. And certainly when we see food safety culture, and I will talk about this a little later as well, food safety culture really pays off in retaining employees, which is difficult right now, and other ways that are benefits beyond food safety. So in talking specifically about farmers market, and you'll note I put this little orange header up here. I don't know how many of you are farm market managers versus actual growers at the market, or maybe serving in both roles, but in some ways, growers that work at farm markets, some things are beyond their control, right? Because the market is what the market is. And so I wanted to be sure when I mentioned this that I recognize that some of these things are very market specific, and maybe out of the control of the growers that are participating. But it's important that everybody work together to keep food safety there. And I saw somebody, oh, he's just connecting, so that's good. So that's why I put that there as a sort of just a caveat. One is the location and adjacent land uses. Certainly, I see farmers markets. This one, this is a picture of, is obviously in a parking lot. I see them in parks. I was at a park one time and the farm market was in this beautiful park and they had all these beautiful trees, but of course they had tons of birds in the trees. And so you're watching sort of these, these farm booths sort of deal with birds that are pooping overhead and trying to handle that. So I think the issue becomes like, where is it? Are there pests that are concerned? Is it birds? Is it rats? Is it, where's your location? If it rains, what's the drainage look like? What's the wind look like if you're located something next to something that you don't want blowing into the market? Again, a bunch of the stuff you can't control, but I know in my hometown, they keep moving the market around, trying to address some of these things. Market participants. Diane had sent me some fact sheets that we made a while ago and, talking about pets. Pets are always an issue at the market. We not only see like, I want to call average pets, so we'll call them dogs and cats, but you sometimes see ferrets and other things that people bring with them to the market. Then those folks who are petting their dog are now maybe touching the produce that you have on your stand. And so I've seen some farm market owners, like, you point to what you want and then they package it for you so that they don't have people touching all the product. I also think we sometimes have groups there that are there more for entertainment or for a tour than for buying. And sometimes that creates challenges, especially if the groups are small children. And I'm a parent and I, of course, went on some field trips to the farmers market and, little kids like to touch things and poke at things and those kind of challenges sometimes that are there. Not all farm markets have toilet and hand washing facilities. I've been to a lot of farm markets that don't. We're starting to see some farm markets put that in, but if toilets and hand washing facilities aren't available, it means that most people are probably not washing their hands before they touch your produce. And that's including vendors, right? So it creates sanitation challenges. And I think the important thing is to work together to establish food safety standards for the market and keep moving in the positive direction. You're not going to fix everything overnight, but knowing what our challenges and knowing what you want to fix are very important. When we talk about farm markets from the grower perspective, I think growers always have the opportunity to encourage patrons to actively participate in food safety, right? So in a lot of locations, people want to bring their own bags, so make sure the bags are clean. The other thing that, if you've heard me speak before, that drives me a little insane is that people get to the farmer's market as soon as it opens early in the morning, and then they leave that produce in their hot car while they run errands for the rest of the day. So making sure people know, right, this is produce. It needs to be kept cool. It needs to go home and not sit in the front seat of your car. So if you're going to run errands, bring a cooler to store it in. Proper holding and preparation at home, reducing cross-contamination risks, making sure they know, do I put my tomatoes in the cold refrigerator? No, that's not going to be good for the quality. And just helping them understand, because I think not all consumers understand the difference in fresh produce. Avoid at the market where you can, having your produce in the hot sun or on the ground, so you're reducing those kind of risks. If you offer samples, do it safely. I was laughing when I was typing this because I was like, oh my. And I can see a little bit of y'all. Are y'all offering samples at the market anymore post-COVID? I think COVID, you are. Okay, great. Yes. Thank you for that.
And if you could expand on that, because I'm joining a new farmer's market. They're not familiar with, my product up in Skinny Atlas. And she seemed real hesitant. I guess since COVID hit, she's kept it with no samples, and she was really hesitant to accept, but that's the only way I can sell my product. So I had, I was given several options by Department of Ag. So I can either serve it in little cuppies, and hand it out. But it's an open cuppy. I also have the little containers, which I think it resonated with her a lot better. They have their design for the sampling. They have the lid and then a little slot for sampling spoons, those teeny ones. So you can take it out, with the
Right.
individual little sampling spoons, hand it out. And I think
Yeah.
that's the option I'm gonna use. It seems the safest one, and then just hand out uh homemade chips with the little clips.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have started to see sampling more in markets. I don't know if I've seen it at a farmer's market, but I definitely have seen samples showing up again. So that's good. I think when you're talking about cut samples or anything, you want to make sure after 2 hours, if they haven't been refrigerated, in a cooler or something that you want to throw them away to make sure you're not allowing things to grow on them that people then eat. Make sure you have clean preparation and storage areas. If you're preparing at home, that's what I would recommend, is like having a specific area that's specific for preparation that is clean, and then putting them in your cups and putting them in a cooler. If you're doing it at the marketplace, just make sure you have a clean place to prep, right? Clean cutting surfaces, clean knives, a sanitary way to serve samples, which you just mentioned, like you're clearly down that right path. And again, having access to water at the market becomes a big deal if you're trying to do sanitation at the market. The other thing I really recommend is be prepared to share what you do for food safety. I think in your case, where you're moving to a new market and they're asking you questions about it, reassuring people that what you're doing and you're not introducing risks, I think is important. With consumers, they may never ask, but the reason I think it's important is it makes you think about how you do what you do. And that often changes the way I do things when I think about explaining it to other people. So that's why I mentioned that, because thinking about how we put together our food safety processes, and how we would explain that to other people, I think just reinforces that we're doing it in the best way, or that we might need to up our game a little bit. Thank you very much for sharing that. Why are you not moving forward here? Okay. I did want to put this in because I sometimes on these calls with folks that do farmers markets, they also do U-Pick. So this is a new illustration we created through a project with the local food safety collaborative. But I thought this was a good illustration to talk about U-Pick having similar considerations, right? You can see the visitors policy, wanting people to wash their hands, not wanting pets, having clean containers, and putting trash where it belongs, and using the toilets and the hand washing sinks as depicted here. When we talk about pre-market preparation, it really is looking at transportation vehicles. As you can see in this picture here, the one truck that does it all, you really should have a sanitation plan. If you have a truck that carries the dog, carries, fertilizer, carries all that stuff, make sure it's clean before you load it. And even vehicles committed to fresh produce transport really should be inspected and cleaned on a regular basis, right? You want to reduce that cross-contamination risk. Having clean packaging or packing of fresh produce. So make sure the containers are clean, make sure they're covered if you're transporting them, make sure your tables and displays are clean. All of these things are related to cross-contamination. And I know in the years past, a little bit of dirt doesn't hurt you and all of that, but it really does reduce the microbial risks when you have clean surfaces. Plans for sanitation while you're at the market. If the market doesn't have hand washing stations, you may want to make your own travel wash station. And I can't even tell you how many instructions I have for building one you can put into a roughneck tub, building one out of wood. There's several instructions, one from University of Minnesota, there's out from University of Vermont. I can, send them if you can't find them, but lots of ways to make really affordable hand washing stations. And then sanitation supplies. If you're cleaning tables or unexpected issues that happen at the market, right? What are you going to do if something does get dirty? Did somebody bleed on your table? I know that sounds kind of crazy, but being prepared to figure out what you're going to do if you need to disinfect or sanitize a surface. And then personal training, and we're going to talk about this a little more, but I wanted to put it in here because I find in talking to growers who send off people to farmers markets, really having those people understand your expectations and all the stuff we talked about, how the produce is supposed to be handled, packed, and provided to customers is so very important to safety. I put in 2 slides only because I see some farms that are doing a lot of value added stuff. And all I wanted to just remind folks is that value added means food safety steps are added too. And the graph on the left was one we did years ago, just talking about, when you're growing fresh fruits and vegetables and you're getting them to the market, really what we're talking about there is good agricultural practices, right? What are those things we're doing in the field, in the packing house, but once you move to sort of packing produce, now you're talking more about good manufacturing practices. And that's where you have a little bit more control over the process. So you can do a little bit more food safety. And then, of course, if you're going to turn a product into a processed product, there you're really talking about HACCP, right? Hazard analysis, critical control points. And the picture on the right is, again, a new illustration that we have, just talking about what those practices are. You can see between the beans and the canned beans, they're cooked to a certain temperature for a certain amount of time, and that ensures that what's in the can is safe. Same with this applesauce, right? So just that idea of value added. If you are wanting to know, wanting to preserve or something, and you need a scheduled process, Cornell's Food Venture Center can help with that. That is not what I typically do, but my colleagues at the Food Venture Center are very skilled at helping growers through those value added steps. I did want to put this in here because this is a farm that I've worked with quite a bit, and they started doing value added activities. They actually constructed this little clean room inside their packing house. And you can see here implementation of cleaning and sanitation practices, and really trying to extend that food system and food availability, right? So you go into a grocery store and a lot of consumers like to see the ready to eat, or what I like to call almost ready to eat, right? You do a little bit of prep at home, things are cut up for you, things are ready to go. Not something we typically see at farmers markets, but I know a lot of farmers market growers are diversifying, so I did want to put in these 2 slides. So when we talk about good agricultural practices during production, we're really talking about the areas that, for the last 20 years, we've been discussing: worker health and hygiene, soil amendments, water use, and that's water use both during production and prior to harvest, as well as water at or after harvest, and considering the risks of those 2 differently because they are different, right? We can use surface water during production. There's an opportunity in the field for risk reduction from desiccation and UVs and solarization that happens. But once you get to harvest and post-harvest, that's real close to consumption. And so you want to be using water that is, has no detectable generic E. coli or is potable, because those are 2 different periods of time in the production process. Certainly wildlife and domesticated animal management is very important. Sanitation is changing a lot with our understanding. And as we see outbreaks where sanitation is, or lack of sanitation is an indication of what caused the outbreak, we're thinking about it differently. And transportation, which we've talked about already, traceability, which I'm going to talk about a little more coming up, and any adjacent land use concerns or considerations that you have to think about because of what's going on land close to you that might be influencing your food safety practices. This is a slide I'm sure most of you have seen talking about contamination sources, but all of these things that we see on the farm, humans, soil, water, buildings and equipment, animals, all of these things can introduce contamination risks. And that's really what we need to prevent that contamination from getting on our produce, because once it's on there, we know washing it off really isn't going to happen. Here's one resource that's been, you know, in its original form, I think it was really productive. We've updated it. It's being used again to make an online tool right now. But this is just a decision tree to help growers think about food safety. And for growers that are new, this is mostly focused on good agricultural practices, though, as I did mention, we have updated it for the PSR. But this is a good tool to help get that discussion started if you have growers that, or if you yourself haven't really thought about it. This is a good place to go. I did want to highlight this because if you're not familiar with on-farm readiness reviews, this is something organized by the National Association of State Departments of Ag, and it's free. If depending on the state you're in, people will come out and do an on-farm readiness review for you. In New York, we do it with Extension and the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. But my colleague Meredith Melendez at Rutgers down here, she actually crunched some numbers of what's been going on. And what this is the folks that come out to do the on-farm readiness review are then asked after they leave your farm to do they don't say who you are or anything, but they say, like, this is what we saw and these were our concerns. And I want to highlight some things here. So you can see, like, missing records and inadequate notification of visitors. And I put them in yellow because they're important, but they don't strike me like this inadequate worker hygiene training or inadequate toilet and hand washing facilities. These really concern me because those are things that can directly lead to contamination of fresh produce. And so much of our stuff is hand-picked that to have our workers not know what they're supposed to be doing and not have access to toilet and hand washing facilities leads me to believe that worker training is still the best bang for the buck in terms of what we're doing. And properly trained workers actively reduce food safety risks every day. And they really help meet those expectations for regulatory and audit compliance as well. But you have to give them the resources so that they can do it every day and make it something that is effective on your farm. And the first step is that worker training program, making sure that you're establishing that food safety culture. And I do want to spend a moment talking about food safety culture because this is something that is more and more running around in my brain and more taking up time trying to figure out how I can help growers move this forward. I'm sorry, I'm stopping to look at some chat comments. Temporary food service permits and hand washing stations. Yep. So in the chat box, Christy, you're correct. Definitely some places have to have hand washing stations for samples. Okay, great. Thank you for that conversation in the chat box, and keep it going, Danielle and Christy. And so anyway, the thing about culture, and this is true of all food safety on the farm, grower commitment is far and away the most important thing. If the grower is not committed to making this happen, it's not going to happen. If a grower is committed to making it happen, we see effective and frequent training that actually gets done. It results in food safety understanding across the farm. And again, I've had so many conversations with growers who initially they'd initially tell me, like, this isn't going to work. And then they call me and they're like, this is working better than I thought it would. So I'm just a firm believer in this. Once employees understand the expectations, they do a good job, and the practices become natural and commonplace and not a struggle. Again, looking at COVID for these growers that had this in place, adding new expectations, yeah, it was an adjustment. It wasn't a crisis. For some folks, it was a crisis, right? So that food safety culture really helps identify and reduce the risks because everybody contributes, small problems get taken care of, they don't become big problems. And again, I'd love your thoughts on this. This is something that I think a lot about, and I really would like to see this more and more happen. Oh, good. Thank you for putting that in, Orange County is having a worker training in Spanish. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so sometimes good practice is just good practice. You know, I can't leave without talking about hand washing because it really is just good for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, always good to wash your hands. Going back to a really old research article, they believe 85% of GI illnesses, not fresh produce related, all GI illnesses could be prevented if people simply wash their hands. I want to switch here to, not switch, but I do want to start introducing FSMA at this point, reminding you that we have the produce safety rule, which if you grow fresh fruits and vegetables, and I'm going to show you the little decision tree, if you sell over $25,000 in fresh produce, fruits and vegetables, adjusted for inflation, so that's up near, I think, 29,000 now, you could be subject to FSMA. If you sell under that, you're just like out, you're excluded. Then there's the option to become qualified exempt, which is if you sell over $500,000 adjusted for inflation, you're in wholly. But then if you're between that 29 and that 500,000 adjusted for inflation, there's some qualified exempts that you can get in there. And I didn't go into this in detail because that's not what I was tasked with. I'll show you the thing and we can talk about it if you have questions, but knowing whether or not you're subject is really, really important. If you're doing stuff where you're doing value added, you also might be subject to the preventive controls for human foods. If some of your product is going to animal feed, you could be subject to that one, preventive controls for animal food. But this other one, food traceability, which is at the bottom of the list here, that's a relatively new one. And I'm going to talk about that just so you're aware of it. So here's the exemptions and exclusions in the FSMA PSR. Again, I'm not going to go over all of this, but it does step you through this to determine if you are covered or not covered by the rule. If you don't know, you should know. So part one, if you don't know, find out. And if you're having trouble, let me know, and I can help you walk through it so that you know whether or not you're subject to the rule. The reason I wanted to bring up the rule is that FDA started enforcement of harvest and post-harvest water as of January this year for the largest businesses. So those folks making over that $500,000 mark. And smaller businesses are going to step in January of next year, and then the very smallest ones January of the following year. So I want you all aware of that. And one of the things in there that happens a lot with post-harvest water is produce washing. And so I have a few slides in here just to make sure we're all on the same page with this. For most consumers, produce washing is something they do prior to consumption, right? USDA recommends washing produce under cool running water. They don't recommend a sanitizer of any sort because they worry people will make themselves sick. If the skin is thick, they tell them to wash it with a brush, scrub the outside of it, make sure you have sanitation on that brush, otherwise that's just gross. But when we talk about fresh produce industry, what we're talking about is washing produce with water. Sometimes this means adding a sanitizer. That sanitizer must be labeled for contact with fruits and vegetables. Typically, EPA produces that label. There are some FDA labels. It's rare. But the point here is it's intended to prevent cross-contamination, not wash individual pieces of fruit. And this is the most important part, which is why earlier I talked about preventing contamination. Because once it's on, you ain't getting it off. We don't have a treatment now that's like 100%. We can see partial log reductions, but that is not enough to make it safe, right? So produce washing, is it really the best term? I don't like the term washing because then I fear that people will use detergents. But most of the washes that we see, there's very little published impact on pathogen reduction on individual fruits and vegetables. What we're looking at again is this prevention of cross-contamination. So if you happen to harvest something that has fecal material on it and you put it in a dump tank and it washes off into the water, that sanitizer is preventing that cross-contamination. Produce washing is not going to control contamination in the field, in the packing house, in the retail establishment. It is not a solve all, which is why we talk about prevention and preventing contamination. Sanitizers and chemicals have to be validated. That's why we recommend the labeled products. And then alternative washes. A while ago, it was during COVID, I worked on an article for, I think, somebody in the New York Times or something. And I actually went and dug up a bunch of articles on vinegar and other alternative washes that people like to use or like to ask about. The research is based on concentration and contact times that would not be common in the home or the industries. And the pathogens that were investigated were very limited and often were not the pathogens we see causing produce-related outbreaks. So it's a very interesting task in terms of looking at that outbreak data. But I just want to say, like, if you're thinking about using vinegar instead of a sanitizer, it's not going to work the way you think it's going to work unless you've read all the literature and you're prepared for those high contact times and extremely strong concentrations. Just to remind you, we do have a tool. If you're interested in looking at sanitizers, we have this sanitizer tool that Donna Clemens from our group works. She's also updating it right now. So you'll see an even better version coming up that's really app-based if you're looking for stuff. But again, if you're going to use the sanitizer, use it properly. It does require management. So just want to say that. The PSR also requires you to have a change schedule. Now, if you're not subject to the rule and you're saying to yourself, well, fantastic, I'm not legally subject to the produce safety rule, I don't have to change my water, I would hesitate, wouldn't hesitate. I would tell you that you still need to think about it in terms of reducing microbial risks, because you can have buildup in that water. And again, if you're not managing the water, you can have microbial risks that can lead to cross-contamination. The PSR does not tell you how you have to determine your change schedule, so that leaves flexibility for growers. It should be based on water use and the risks. You could, sorry, I have a snafu there. You could rely more on sanitizer monitoring if you're using a sanitizer to make sure the sanitizer is being effective. But tanks with lots of water cannot easily be dumped and refilled, so they become more challenging if you have, say, a 10,000 gallon flume tank, as opposed to these smaller tanks that you see in this picture that are more easily changed. I did this, again, I've been trying to share some illustrations we have because I think they're really nice. The point of this illustration is to show you that if you get contamination in the field of some of these very small microorganisms into these very complex surfaces, this is why it's tough to wash off, right? There were some cantaloupe studies done years ago where they washed cantaloupe that had been contaminated with 3,000 ppm of chlorine. You would never do this. It's not labeled for that use. The produce isn't edible after you do it. It was a science experiment in a lab. But the point is, this netting provides these hydrophobic areas where the sanitizer doesn't even have access. So again, you're not going to wash it off once it's there. That's why we want to prevent contamination. And we know, like, strawberries are field picked and put in a clamshell and off they go. You're not even washing those. So I have to say this, do you need to wash produce before selling it? The answer is no, right? The PSR doesn't require it. Some buyers require it. Some farm practices require it. I had a colleague in Minnesota say, they use it for getting worms out of broccoli or something. So there are some reasons why you would do it, but it does come with challenges that can negatively impact shelf life. And post-harvest water has to be managed to maintain microbial safety. So if you're going to use it, make sure you're using it properly. That's, I guess, my whole theme to these last 4 slides. The post-harvest water requirements of the PSR require you to do an agricultural water systems inspection. And we have a new fact sheet that just came out in May trying to describe what is an agricultural water systems inspection. I mention this for 2 reasons. 1, if you're subject to the rule, you need to be aware of this. 2, if you're not subject to the rule, it is really good to understand your agricultural water system on your farm and how it might be introducing risk. So I wanted to highlight this fact sheet for both those who are covered and those who are not covered. I do want to tell you that standards for water used during production have been proposed. The comment period is over. You can see here it came out in December 2nd of 2021. And the expectation, what we think is going to happen based on the proposed rule, is that we're going to move from testing water as the primary metric for decision making to an agricultural water assessment. Now, this fact sheet I just showed you previously requires this agricultural water systems inspection. The agricultural water systems inspection is different than the proposed agricultural water assessment. Both are good to know about. Both are good to think about, but I need you to understand they're two different things. And again, the expectation here is for each grower to set their own standards based on their own farm. And that puts a lot of responsibility onto the farmers. So I wanted you all aware of that. The agricultural water assessment includes these things. And again, I didn't have time to, we have supplemental slides on this. If you want them, I can send them to you. You can go to our website and download them. It steps through this in detail. But it talks about the agricultural water system. It talks about the practices you're using. It also includes talking about crop characteristics. What are you growing? What's the susceptibility to surface adhesion and internalization of water? What are the environmental conditions that are happening on your farm and other factors? And this includes testing, but it's, again, you can see testing show up here at the bottom. It's a very different approach. It's a much more holistic, broad approach to thinking about water use and risk assessment, okay? That's what's in the PSR. Now I'm switching gears right here to just bring you up to speed that there's these traceability requirements now. That final rule was published November 21st of 2022, so last November. Important part, if you are subject to this rule, everybody who is subject, it will become effective January 20th of 2023. There is no stepped in effective dates for this, right? January 20th of, oh, sorry, the effective date is 2023. The implementation date is 3 years from that date. So 2026, sorry, up here, this compliance date. And that is for everyone. So not just big farms, then medium farms, then small farms. Everybody comes in January 20th of 2026. So I think you should find out if you're subject to it. And if you are, start working on it, because there are really relevant things here. One is how they've defined who's involved in this first bullet is very interesting. And I suspect we're going to hear more about that from FDA. Exemptions mirror some produce safety rule exemptions and exclusions, but not the qualified exemption one. So you need to understand, am I subject to it? Food packaged on the farm may be exempt, as long as you protect against contamination and it remains intact all the way to the consumers. There are provisions for waivers, and they do have an exemptions and exclusions tool that you can see here listed at the end that you can walk through to see if you're subject to it. And again, I just encourage you to know where you stand on this so you know what you have to do. There are specific foods that are covered. You can see here that we listed a bunch of them. Again, this comes out of our supplemental material that you can download and take a look at. But I wanted to put this on your radar to make sure if you grow these commodities and you're subject to the traceability rule, that you're aware of what that is going to do to your farm. I will end here by talking about, this is the Produce Safety Alliance team. We have a couple of new people. Yuli Menensis, who's here. She's our Spanish language extension associate located in Miami, Florida. Donna Clemens, who used to be our Southwest extension associate, moved and became our coordinator and Northeast extension associate when Gretchen Wall left us for the International Fresh Produce Association. And all of these folks are available for you to reach out to. I noticed you mentioned doing a training in Spanish. A lot of our Spanish language extension associates are doing full trainings, PSA trainings for Spanish speaking folks, as well as train the trainers. Please provide links to supplemental materials. I will do that, Amy. When I quit sharing, I'll go put a bunch of stuff in the chat box while we're having a conversation if you guys have questions. Here's our website. We have it in English and in Spanish for those of you that need it in different languages. It's available to you. All of the stuff, the supplemental slides are all there. They're under the resources tab, but I'll go ahead and again put them in the chat box so you have the links. And we are also on social media, trying to figure out where it's most important for us to be spending time on social media, and what you guys want to know. So if you have any opinions about, I prefer certain kinds of social media posts, let us know. We're always tweaking that. That is always a topic of conversation. So with that, I'm going to, oh, sorry, that's not it. I'm going to stop sharing and take questions. See if I hit the mark.
So if you have any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself so we can all hear both the question and the answer. Well, let me get it started.
Okay.
So for those that are market managers, what do you think is the importance? What are the important steps that they should look at as they're walking through the market each market day to ensure that every customer can be confident that the food they're going to be eating is safe?
That's an interesting question because it's going to be so variable by market. So I think one thing as a market manager is just stepping back and looking at your market as a whole, right? Are you a market that lets people bring pets? And a lot of markets do because people love their pets, right? So if you're a market that has pets, is that working for you, right? Are there concerns you have with that? How is your market organized, right? Like I gave the example of that park that had just terrible bird problems, right? Are you located in a place where there's other challenges you have? And if so, how do you address those challenges, right? Once you get past the market as a whole, like looking at, do we have toilets and hand washing facilities? Do we have, portable ones even that we can bring in to up our game here, instruct people to do that? Then it comes down to what's going on in each of your farm market booths, right? Are people, keeping produce off the ground? Are people providing clean surfaces? Do the marketers, are they doing the right thing? Or, years ago, somebody told me they were at a farm market and one of the produce growers brought a pet chicken that he sort of tethered to his fruit and vegetable stand. And it sort of had this chicken floating around, a live chicken. So if you have stuff like that going on, those would be things that would be like sort of red flags for me, right? But it is really interesting to see what happens at some markets and to see the customers that come through, and controlling people is really difficult. And in today's world, people are gruff and confrontational sometimes. So it can be difficult. Does that help? Is that reasonable?
I think that gives everybody an idea of some of the things they need to look at or think about. Of course, we do have that set of protocols on the Federation website under food safety, and people can look at that as well. So what other questions do people have? We've got a lot of information today, and I'm sure we have some questions.
Yeah, I can definitely send Diane the slides so she can distribute them to you if that works.
Yeah, we'll put them out on the listserv so that it extends beyond just the attendees.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to download the links to those slides. Any other questions? How are things going? Was this when you dialed in today hoping to learn something, was this what you hoped to learn, or were there questions you had that I did not cover? Because I'm always interested, I had talked to Diane about like what she thought would be of interest. And so I tried to pull some new things and cover stuff, but I'm always interested what you guys think is most helpful. And you can put it in the chat box. You don't have to unmute.
Do you think we're going to see some rules coming down that are going to impact farmers markets beyond just the farmer itself?
That is always hard for me to tell. And I was laughing at I did laugh. One of the things we had talked about, or that was in the materials you shared with me, was how a lot of the rules fall on growers, but they don't make it to like the retailers, right?
Exactly.
They don't. It's very interesting where they tend to put pressure on people to do food safety and where they don't. So I don't feel like I have a crystal ball that works on that one.
Okay.
I do. One of the things that is on my radar that I did not talk about, but that I think should be on your radar in terms of prepping for questions, is a lot of water municipalities, my understanding is, are going to start testing for PFAS in municipal water sources this summer. And I suspect we're going to have a lot of PFAS show up in municipal water sources. And then there's going to be a big discussion about what's going on with that water. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's something I'm paying attention to.
Okay.
Nobody else?
I thought we would have a lot of questions today, but
Yeah. Well, they're all still here. So I'm sort of like, come on, peeps.
I think we've just swamped them with so much information.
Maybe. Well, and that's important for me to know too. If it was too overwhelming, you should let me know. I tried to make it informative, but if I overdid it, I welcome that feedback as well.
Well, one thing, we do record this and we archive it on our website. So if it was a lot for you to take in at once, you can go back and listen to it again. Because I know I'm planning to.
Yeah. What are the thanks, Brittany. What are your biggest challenges? What do you guys, just put it in the chat box? What's your biggest food safety challenge? When you think about your operation, what's the thing that keeps you up at night, or that bothers you, or that you think, oh, this is one I'm going to have trouble with?
Well, I can tell you from my farm, the issue of wild animals in the field and having to block off a certain amount of product when you find fecal matter in the field.
Yep.
You know, I'm a small grower, and that's going to be a real issue.
Yep. Yeah, no, and that's a tough one too, because I think that's really about learning, like, what is my risk here, right? How widespread is it, and what makes a reasonable buffer? And you're right, when it's small plot, a small buffer can still take out a lot of product.
It does.
Yeah, so that's the one. Getting outdated fruits and vegetables. Okay. Food safety for caterers, hot food vendors would be my biggest concern. Yeah. I mean, there, at least it's hot food. And as long as you can stop the contamination after it comes from being hot, right? So that's like a lot of food handler and a lot of clean container. Getting outdated fruits and vegetables, does that mean you're concerned about the growers bringing old product to the market? I only know what my farmers' produce safety practices are. Oh, yeah, Amy. Okay, so Regina said yes, getting dated fruits and vegetables. I think that's a conversation that both of those things, Amy, are conversations to have with growers. If you, like, for instance, if you've never brought it up, if you've never brought up food safety practices with your farmers, one of the best ways to do it is when you're outside of market dates is I'd be happy to dial into a meeting and sort of introduce the topic. You can introduce the topic. You can use tools we have to introduce the topic. But if it's a new concept to growers, sometimes it's not real smart to throw them into a huge day-long training, but it's better to have a conversation about here's our food safety concerns and let them ask questions. A lot of growers who haven't thought about food safety before oftentimes don't understand why it's important. So it's good to have that time when they can ask questions and sometimes tell you they think you're crazy for thinking food safety is an issue. But that's how I would go about doing it. I see another. I sent them an invitation to the Zoom, but they didn't come. That's great. Sometimes you just got to organize it just for them. Tell them there's just a conversation just for them. And some markets, let me say this, busier markets require food safety. So you can't be a market person there unless you have food safety practices. So I'm not sure how much you can turn the screws to that. Jurisdictional confusion for food safety laws at markets has been an issue. We have producers, different cottage laws. Yes, 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 and yes, Ivory. Thank you for that. It is crazy to me the difference in cottage food laws state to state. And there are some states that essentially, if I lived in that state, I would be like, buy at your own risk, because their cottage laws essentially let people do whatever they want. And other states, they don't. So, maybe one of the things we could do about that, Ivory, is if you knew the states that were involved, maybe talk to their state departments of ag and maybe do a little call with Diane like this and have those folks on to talk about the variation in cottage food laws and how they differ. This is something I would like to bring up to NECAFS, the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety, because the Department of Ag folks really get together at that meeting. And if it's a big enough problem, we could push them, make them make a state by state sort of, so you had some idea what was going on. But that's a huge, huge point. Huge point, Ivory. Thank you for sharing that. Raul, one thing that concerns me is, Yep. So one thing that concerns them is the mix of farms that comply with food safety versus the farms that don't comply and are not regulated, because those products are in close proximity. Absolutely. When you're talking at a market, one of the examples I always use, and we've seen this in some outbreaks, is growers will tell me, I've never made anybody sick. And I'm like, okay, you're a farm market person. You sell to 50 different families. What's the incubation period of the organism that you possibly gave them? Say it's norovirus or something. That's 48, 72 hours. How do they know it's you that made them sick? Right. And so I really think trying to get everybody at the farmers market to embrace food safety, or at least to understand, because they're all tied together in that market. Right. And if something happens in the market, everybody's going to get swept up in that. So completely agree with that. I'm actually our food safety expert on the board of our farmers market. My job is to make sure everyone has licenses they need. Great. I think the thing that Raul just pointed out, Danelle, I hope I'm saying your name right. I realize there's not an E and I called you Danielle earlier, but the interesting thing about licenses are that some growers, if they're not doing something that's regulated at the state level, they might not need a license. And sometimes fruits and vegetables fall into that. Yeah, it's good to sort of just keep, even if it's good ag practices and aren't required, to keep that on the front. Ivory, Pennsylvania is a whole different ball game. Would it be helpful, Ivory, to sort of see if we could get them to work on, I can't say I can get them to work on something, but I could certainly try and push that if that would be something helpful. Yeah, because that cottage food things, I've run across that a couple of different states, and man, it's crazy, the difference. Okay, fantastic. I'll put that out.
You know, one of those comments in the chat pot made me think back when New York State implemented the no plastic bag rule.
Right.
And then it
Right.
went away during COVID because they were afraid of, whatever they were afraid of, but they brought it back now. How does that align with all of this discussion? Because just like somebody said, this farmer is really complying, this farmer is not so much, but their produce is all going into the same tote bag that the farm or that the customer is carrying, as opposed to being segregated by being in their own plastic bags.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a huge problem, right? And I know some growers have gone to, brown paper sacks and stuff that they're allowed to use. But it is a huge issue. And then you get into people bringing the I'm gonna say dirty, not what the word that I want to say. They bring their own bags and they're dirty.
Mhm.
Right? Or they've carried, I mean, when I go to the grocery store, I have a meat bag. If I buy meat, it goes in the meat bag. But most people just use their bags for everything,
Yep.
right? Raw meat goes
Yep.
in with the produce. So yeah, that's a huge issue. And I think, again, anything we can do to educate consumers about, like, signs at the market. Are your bags clean? Don't cross-contaminate. Anything you can do to raise awareness for consumers is going to be good for your market. And sometimes it's just as simple as a sign, and it's not going to get everybody, but it'll get some people. And we have designed, posters over time to help with that. I saw Raul say he believes that farmers markets should request they comply. I absolutely agree. I've worked with a lot of farm marketers over the years to work on food safety trainings. Again, the one I'm thinking of, she's in Western Missouri, and man, her farm market, she's been doing food safety for years before it was ever a regulation, and really pushing her growers to get on board. We also do a farm inspection and questions on farm sanitary training. Yep. That's fantastic. I think anything you can do to help growers, again, if you're in New York, and I know other states do it, the on-farm readiness review, that's more for the PSR, so not as helpful. But yeah, anything you can do to raise that awareness to people is helpful. I find that wagging of the finger is not very helpful, right? Like, so when I work with growers, I try not to be the uber goober who's like, you have to do this, but really to just highlight the importance and what they get out of it. Because I do think it is, I truly believe, having done this for about 24 years, growers that are doing food safety just have lower anxiety, the operation runs smoother, and the produce has less risks. So you're not going to get to zero, right? We're not going to get to no risk because this is fresh produce, but it really does work well for the growers in a lot of other areas aside from food safety. Yep. Food safety should be a style of farming, not something that farmers are forced or encouraged to comply with. I absolutely agree. And this is, I cannot tell you how many farmers I've trained that afterwards say, I didn't know that was so risky, and I can do it a different way that doesn't take more time or cost more money. So we're not always talking about changing things. I mean, we're not always talking about things that cost money or cost more time. Sometimes they just don't know what they're doing has a risk. And once you tell them, then they do it a different way. So yeah, I completely agree with that. The thing for me is knowledge. Knowledge is power. And I find that growers don't do risky things because they don't care. They do risky things because they don't know. And that's why these ideas that you guys have been sharing about helping people, pointing out when there's something risky going on, giving them those observations, those are the important things. And doing it in a collective way to encourage everybody to do food safety so that it is a style of farming, as Raul points out. Like, this is just the best practice and this is what you want to do. So I really appreciate those comments. And I think that's really where we're going to make strides forward. Other things, Diane? I know we're at the 2 o'clock hour, so I also want to respect time.
I don't have anything else. I think you've covered everything that was in my mind.
All right. Oh, one new message here. Yeah. Okay. So recommendations for educational food safety resources for ESL growers. Yes. Our Spanish website has a lot of stuff in Spanish. The other documents that I showed you a lot today are part of our More Than Words series. And there are a bunch of illustrations. I'm in the middle of finishing teaching notes, but the illustrations are up. And those are helpful to growers because they're more pictures. And so depending on the language your growers speak, we don't have to get into languages, right? Because we know we have a lot of immigrant farmers that are speaking other languages. I do have a video series I was hoping to post last week. It's not posted yet, but worker training, there's going to be 5 different languages represented there. English, Spanish, Hmong, Chinese, and what's the other one? Oh, Haitian Creole. So there are more materials coming out, and is that helpful, Ivory? If there's a specific language you're interested in, let me know. I know we're working on, the PSA curriculum is available in a bunch of different languages, including Portuguese, and you can just pull from that as well.
Okay, with that, I want to thank everyone for coming on today and being so forthright with all of your comments and concerns. And certainly thank you to Betsy for such an amazing presentation full of information and all of that. And if there's anything you want to send me that I can send back out to our attendees and those that are going to be listening to this when it's on our website, I'd be happy to do that. Would love to do that. But
Yeah,
thank you again for being with us today.
right. And Diane, I do want to say there's been a couple of things. The last comments were about Spanish speaking growers, and the PSA team has 3 full-time Spanish language extension associates. So if you do want help, like if there's farmers like having that short discussion about food safety, doesn't have to be full-blown PSA. I see Raul said Orange County is now doing work in that area. So whether it's extension folks that are already doing it in New York State, or whether you want to reach out to PSA, definitely help those growers get linked into the information they need, because there's a lot of resources in Spanish. Okay, thanks, Diane.
Okay, thank you all. Join us next month. We will be talking about an online farmers market. It's actually developed by farmers in New York State. It's called Grown By, and they are working with the USDA to be able to accept SNAP benefits online through that platform. So if you join us next month, we'll be hearing from them. Thank you.